I'm Tom Goldstein. I'm the publisher of SCOTUSblog. I'm a Washington lawyer. I have a law firm called Goldstein and Russell. I teach Supreme Court litigation at Stanford and Harvard Law Schools. Well, the first 8 minutes of coverage when it came to the cable news side of things of the decision was obviously really unfortunate. CNN in particular is, apoplectic about its error. Fox News is much more comfortable with kind of here's what we thought at the time, and you're experiencing it with us, and it's a mistake that should not have happened, and I don't think will happen again for a while. It's akin to what happened with the 2000 election, when who wins, switching back and forth. And it was an avoidable mistake, and most of the media did avoid the mistake. The first 4 wire services got it exactly right, and it was possible to get right if you were just a little bit more patient than they were. Sure. Well, there was a couple of things happened in reporting the decision. There was an expectation that it was going to be struck down. And so that when someone said it's been invalidated, that met with the expectation of the producers and the people in the control room. Second, the cable news networks were so tightly wound into their social media and web properties, particularly CNN, and they had kind of bunched up at the gate all of this reaction that they wanted to put out there because they came at it from a political angle rather than a question of healthcare being available, because that was kind of just the more exciting take in the middle of a presidential campaign on it. And the only thing they really did to pause to make sure they had it right, besides asking their people who had copies of the opinion, are you sure, was to look up and see each other reporting the same thing. And at that point, then they had all of this stuff that they wanted to say, and in a really breathless kind of way, and oddly breathless. I mean, everybody knew the decision was going to come down at 10 o'clock that morning. The provision of the law wouldn't take effect for 2 more years, and the election is not until November. And so it's kind of strange that that they would burst out of the starting gate in that way. But there was, those things did conspire to produce a situation where CNN in particular had a little bit of a hard time walking it back over the course of those 8 minutes. More broadly, in terms of the coverage of the decision, I'm perfectly comfortable with people kind of making of it what they will, and there's a self-referential quality to the idea of this has huge political implications, because the more the media says it has huge political implications, that's actually in large part what's driving its being consequential politically, and that is all the yammering about it has turned it from, and the individual mandate is obviously originally a Republican idea, and it has, through a bunch of political commentary, become viewed as anathema to individual liberty by conservative Republicans. But nonetheless, it is what it is, and a very important part of the implications of the decision were political. And that's very accessible to people. Ordinary Americans are pretty used to thinking about those things like that in those terms, whereas legal doctrine like the Commerce Clause and the taxing power kind of just flies over everybody's head, and the implications for healthcare markets are relatively complicated. And so it doesn't surprise me or trouble me that people would look at it that way. I actually like the fact that a lot more people pay attention to the Supreme Court for whatever reason, because the court is an underappreciated institution, not undervalued, whether it's good or bad. People just don't watch it enough. Yeah, I think so. I think that the fact that more Americans engaged the Supreme Court is civically good, because the court is doing some good things and some bad things. And it's a lasting legacy of every president, not every, but every president who does get to make the appointments. And the public ought to be more aware of what effect the judiciary has on them, for good or bad. You may love things the Supreme Court's doing. You may despise them, but it's very hard to make the argument that the Supreme Court is inconsequential. Well, the part of the difficulty is that mainstream media is really driving for eyeballs and attention more than it's driving exclusively for substance and accuracy and balance in things that can sometimes be very boring. So one of the things that you have is that the institutional concerns that seem to in part drive the healthcare decision. So putting entirely to the side the idea that the Chief Justice was concerned about the reputation of the institution, which is difficult to figure out given the uncertain popularity of the law. But the idea of institutional competence and responsibility, the Chief Justice says, look, our job is not to strike down a law every time we can find an excuse to do it. It's to find a way to uphold the law if there is a way of doing it under the Constitution. That's our job. We're the last resort, not the first resort. That gets spun a lot as by people who don't like the decision as being a cop-out, in the same way that a lot of more conservative decisions get attacked by the liberals as being driven by partisan interests of another kind. But these institutional concerns exist across a huge body of the court's jurisprudence. It balances them in different ways in different cases so that the court's conservatives believe very strongly in the right to engage in campaign spending, for example. And you get decisions like Citizens United because they believe that's a core First Amendment right. And in that situation, they don't hesitate to override what seem to be very well-studied judgments by Congress about the effect of spending on confidence in the electoral system. And there's a good chance the court's going to strike down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act this term, affirmative action programs. It's not that the court as a whole or the court's conservatives really do tend to just say, I'm only going to strike something down if I absolutely have to. At the same time, the court does often show a recognition of limits on its institutional competence when it comes to things like regulation of jails, when it comes to strip searches in the past term. There are a lot of different times when they say, we're not the best people to make this decision. There are other people who are better at this for us at making this kind of judgment. You don't see, however, from the current Supreme Court a vision of that extends across bodies of law. Sometimes they are super confident and very willing to intervene, and other times they seem more willing to take a back seat, and I would be hard-pressed to draw a straight line between those points. But in terms of media coverage, the latter cases where the court is kind of saying, okay, we're going to defer to the jailers or to state legislators here, it's just not very interesting. When the court doesn't do something and says, we're going to let this be. Somebody else has got this in hand. It's not our responsibility. It's just not very sexy or controversial. And as a consequence, millions of people are not going to tune in to hear the fight about it. It can be turned into a fight by, as in the healthcare case, turning into allegations of the Chief Justice just trying to, for the wrong reasons, protect his institutional legitimacy and his own popularity. But by and large, people are just sort of like, that's dull.